I'd like to start by thanking the Esquimalt Songhees Nation, on whose unceded territory we're meeting today. We were taking better care of it. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Philippe Lucas. I'm I'm a researcher with the Center for Addictions Research of British Columbia. And my research focuses on the use of cannabis as well as medical cannabis. I'm a former Victoria City Councillor and a CRD Director. And I'm an educator and a father of a 4-year-old who wants to ensure that our drug laws and regulations don't increase the risks and repercussions of cannabis use for my daughter or for anyone else who might choose to use cannabis. I want to thank you for joining us today to discuss what has often been described as a contentious issue. I say contentious not because there's really any more debate about whether or not we should be changing our cannabis laws or moving forward with cannabis reform. Recent polling suggests that 70% of people in BC don't support the current cannabis prohibition, that we overwhelmingly, by a large majority, support changes in cannabis access, particularly for the possession by adults. And ultimately, I think we need to remind some of our politicians that that's greater support than any of the federal parties currently have or any of the provincial parties currently have as well. I think that the reason it's contentious, and as we'll see in this week's discussion at UBCM, isn't whether or not we should change our cannabis laws, but really the discussion tonight is going to be about what cannabis access is going to look like in a post-prohibition regime. And with that in mind, I'd like to start out by introducing the sponsor of this event and the real host for this evening, Dana Larsen. Dana Larsen is a long-time drug policy reform advocate. He's the founder of the Vancouver Medicinal Cannabis Dispensary Society. And he's also the founder of Sensible BC. If you'll help me welcome Dana Larsen.
Thank everyone from the bottom of my heart of being here. You know, you put on an event like this and you're not sure if anybody's going to show up or what's going to happen, but since we launched the Sensible BC campaign, we've had a massive amount of media coverage, and I've been overwhelmed with emails and phone calls and people who want to volunteer and who want to help and want to get involved. And like Philippe said, I've been working in cannabis and drug policy reform really for all of my adult life. And most of our work has been trying to avoid something bad from happening. There's a law that somebody wants to pass and we try to stop it or we try to mediate it, whether it was the things the Liberals are doing in the 90s or whether it's Stephen Harper's mandatory minimums. Most of our effort as drug law reformers is about trying to stop things from getting worse. And what I like about the Sensible BC campaign is we've written our own law for this province. And we're taking a proactive, positive approach. We're not just trying to stop things from getting worse. We want to make them better in British Columbia. We want to find a solution, or the beginning of a solution in our province to these issues and to what the problems of cannabis prohibition are. And so I worked with Kirk Tusaw, who's on the panel here, and several others, and we put together a piece of legislation that we call the Sensible Policing Act. And this legislation essentially instructs all police in British Columbia to not spend any of their time or resources engaging in searches or seizing or arresting or detaining anybody over simple possession of cannabis. And now we recognize that's not going to solve all the problems, that's not the final step or the final solution, but decriminalizing cannabis as a province, decriminalizing cannabis possession is a great first step. And really, wherever anybody lies on the spectrum of cannabis issues, you don't find a lot of people saying we got to crack down on those pot smokers. You don't find a lot of people who want to go after the users. And so I think that's the first place to start, that we can agree that people who use cannabis are not criminals, that the police really have better things to do with their time. And the Sensible Policing Act goes further than that, though. It also mandates our province to begin looking at how we're going to regulate and control and how we're going to have a legal market for cannabis in our province. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I know what I would like to see, but I find in the cannabis reform movement and in this broader movement that we're developing, we're agreed that prohibition is the problem and that what we're doing now is really bad. But the details of the solution, how many plants should be able to grow, what should the tax rate be, what should the age limit be, how should you be able to acquire cannabis, should there be a potency limit, all those kind of questions, we don't really have answers to those things yet. And I think that's where this debate needs to go. We've got a consensus that cannabis prohibition has failed, but what do we do instead? How do we solve this problem? Where do we go next? And so this is the beginning of that dialogue, of going to communities and getting regular people to come out who believe in this issue and who want to see some change. Let's talk about how we're going to do it and hammer out some of those details and figure out where we're going, because we can't introduce a better cannabis law until we know what that's going to be. And the Sensible BC campaign, we were aiming for a referendum in our province, but we don't have to have a referendum. This legislation can be passed by any provincial government across Canada, not just in BC. Any province can pass this legislation and begin this process of changing the dialogue and of moving away from prohibition as a province. And this isn't something that is just unique to cannabis. Provinces often have this tension with the federal government over various laws and how they're going to enforce things. Provinces have the jurisdiction over policing and over the administration of justice. And the police in British Columbia, the RCMP and other police forces are supposed to set their priorities and their goals based on those set for them and based on a dialogue from the Attorney General of the province. The Attorney General of the province is supposed to give direction to the RCMP and give direction to the police. Here's what we want you to do, here's your priorities, focus on this, don't focus on that. And yet, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen cannabis possession charges double from 2005 to 2010 in Vancouver, and it's not, or in British Columbia. And it's not that they're fleeing from some other thing, because the charges for trafficking and for cultivation, they're staying about the same. And although they claim that exporting of cannabis is really what they're focused on and the big deal, all the bud going down to the US, there's only less than 10 people get charged with exporting cannabis every year in British Columbia. The war on cannabis is a war on cannabis possession, and the war on drugs ultimately, in terms of how resources are directed, the war on drugs is ultimately a war on cannabis users. Most of the resources in what we call the war on drugs goes into busting and processing and dealing with pot smokers. And so it's time for a change on that. And so our goal with the Sensible BC campaign is to get this legislation passed, and I believe the best way to do that is through a referendum in our province. And we have fixed referendum dates in British Columbia, and so regardless of when we have all the signatures in place, the next referendum is scheduled for September 2014. And so our plan is to register people, and we've got a table over here, we've got volunteers that are coming around. We want to register folks in advance so that when next September comes, we have an army of volunteers who can go to the homes and contact those who have already registered and get them to sign up. So we don't have to go to the mall or to the park or to wherever and try to find people that will support us. And so we've really got it's going to be a marathon over the next year. We've got a lot of work to do to bring this forward. And I believe this can succeed. And I'm very excited because, like I said, this is the first time as a community of drug policy reformers that we've got our own legislation, we've got a positive, proactive thing that we can pass that will have a huge influence in our province and across Canada. And I'm sure many of you have heard that the American states of Washington, Oregon, and Colorado are all going to be voting in September on various forms of legalization. If Washington is successful and their ballot has over 60% support among decided voters, they will be allowed to possess and purchase up to an ounce of cannabis at a government-run marijuana shop. And that will be huge for the states, and it'll be huge for British Columbia as well. That the argument is so commonly that we gotta be, yeah, you're right, we gotta change it, but America will freak out and they'll close the borders. Well, that's not going to happen. And in fact, many American states have gone much further than Canada has in terms of medical marijuana access. Many states have decriminalized cannabis where it's only a small fine or there's no penalty at all for possession. And so we are perfectly positioned in British Columbia right now to make this change happen. And the turnout we have in this room tonight is fabulous, and it shows that people care about this issue. And you know, they always talk about the young people, and we watch out for the young people smoking marijuana. Well, at our medical marijuana dispensary, we have a lot of senior citizens that come in who have never used cannabis before, or they haven't used it for decades, and they've been told, or they realize it'll help them medicinally. I look in our audience here, I see people of all age groups, I see a lot of people who look like they're over 50, and I think that's important that we have a broad demographic and that we can show it's not about people who want to get high, it's not about kids who disrespect the law, it's about understanding that this policy is harmful, it's failed. Cannabis prohibition causes far more harm than cannabis ever could. And whatever your feelings about marijuana, whether you think marijuana is a harmful, dangerous thing that no one should use, we can reduce use, we can reduce the harm, we can make it better in a regulated and controlled environment. And I think that's the message we have today. And I said I'm very grateful to see you all here. Please visit us online at sensiblebc.ca to register or fill out one of our forms here. And if at the end of today you're passionate and you want to get involved, take some of our sign-up sheets, bring them to your friends and to your family and to your workplace. Get folks to sign up, get those sheets back to us so we can register people. We've got a lot of work to do over the coming year. We need about 400,000 signatures to make this succeed. It's a huge effort, but I believe we can do it. We've got a lot of support across this province, and certainly cannabis law reform has far broader support than even ending the HST did. And that was a very successful campaign. So if they can do it, we can do it better. And so I'll be speaking again at the end. So I hope you're as passionate about this as I am, and I hope that you are excited to be part at the beginning of a movement that's going to change the cannabis laws in British Columbia. And when we succeed in this, it will mark the beginning of the end of prohibition in Canada. I guarantee you, other provinces will follow. Folks say that Stephen Harper won't like it, but you know, Stephen Harper doesn't always get what he wants. Stephen Harper Conservatives wanted to shut down Insight. They went to the greatest effort to the Supreme Court of Canada, where many of these judges were appointed by Stephen Harper, and they still lost that battle. And we will win this battle as well. That's all I have to say for right now. Thank you very much for being here again, and I'll speak to you again at the end of the panel. Thank you very much.
Dana Larsen, if not in BC, where? That's the question, right? If someone's going to take the lead on this change, it's got to be BC.